When the startling news broke that in God's providence, missionary Jesse Minor was no more, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions found themselves in a tough place. Not only were they financially responsible to relocate Minor's widow and children back to New York, but they needed to find a replacement who could continue the work that Jesse Minor had begun. The cost of hiring a new missionary and then paying his moving expenses would be daunting. And eventually, the financially strapped American Board of Commissioners transferred the oversight of the mission to the Society in Scotland for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge. An additional challenge was the understandable reality that theologically trained ministers were hard to come by. Convincing a candidate to leave the comforts of Eastern society for an errand in the wilderness would be an uphill climb. To work among Native Americans far from civilization, without ready access to the basic supplies of life, appeared unattractive to many candidates. In God's goodness and wisdom, a recent graduate of the Andover Theological Seminary became interested in the work. This candidate was Cutting Marsh, the fourth child of Samuel and Sally Marsh. Cutting was born on July 20, 1800 in Danville, Vermont. According to Roger Nichols, Cutting was the only one of the 6 children to be given a non-biblical name. He was named after a maternal great-great-grandfather, Cutting Moody. Cutting Marsh was converted in 1817 when he experienced a profound religious awakening and regarded this event as a turning point in his life, according to Nichols. Marsh later wrote, in the year 1817 in Danville, near the close of a revival of religion, I indulged the humble hope that I had passed from death to life. Sensing a call to the ministry, Marsh studied first at Dartmouth College and then at Andover Theological Seminary in Andover, Massachusetts. According to Nichols, the Andover faculty was composed of men who were either Congregationalists or Presbyterians and accepted the orthodox principles of Christianity drawn from the Bible and the Westminster Assembly. Marsh's entire education had been in institutions following these orthodox Calvinistic Puritan views and ideals. He was a Presbyterian. He was a Calvinist. Upon graduation, Marsh was ready for ordination in the hopes of serving as a foreign missionary to the Sandwich Islands, another name for the Hawaiian Islands. Because there were no missionary openings in the Sandwich Islands, Marsh initially agreed to serve for 1 year among the Stockbridge Indians in Wisconsin. On September 24, 1829, Cutting Marsh was ordained by the Newburyport Presbytery of the Synod of New England. He was also commissioned by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions at the historic Park Street Church located in Boston. 3 weeks later, he left home to travel to the Wisconsin Territory. He arrived in Detroit on November 2nd, only to discover that the last boat of the season to Green Bay had already departed. Travel was closed on the Great Lakes due to an early and severe winter. Marsh remained in Ohio over that winter, helping a mission station in Maumee, Ohio. And there he had his first acquaintance with Native Americans. In his journal, Marsh observes that I had an opportunity for gaining a more extensive knowledge of the Indian character than I otherwise could, of seeing and learning how stations ought to be managed, as well as of studying considerably and writing a number of sermons. In addition to all this, I had an opportunity of preaching the gospel to a great many immortal souls. So already we see some marks of a missionary. He is trying to understand the people whom he would serve and gains this extensive knowledge of Indian character. But he's also looking at practical things, how a mission station should operate. And then there's the preaching side of it. He reveled in opportunities to preach the gospel to lost souls. When the travel opened again in the spring, Marsh set off for Green Bay. He arrived on Friday, April 30, 1830, and he traveled immediately by canoe down the Fox River to Statesburg. He arrived late in the evening on Saturday, May 1st, and he was prepared to lead worship and to preach the next morning. In his 1831 report to the Society in Scotland for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge, Marsh recorded his initial impressions. He says, I was on the first Sabbath struck with the stillness which pervaded in the settlement as I proceeded to the place of worship, and nothing which I witnessed was calculated to disturb the repose of the sacred day. I could at first hardly persuade myself that I was on missionary ground. I have since found that the Sabbath here is generally observed, all kinds of labor are suspended, and many of them observe it with great strictness. He continued his description of that first worship service, saying, When I arrived at the place of worship, which is not large, I found it filled with decently clad and apparently devout worshipers. There is on the Sabbath a very general attendance at meeting, and better order and more stillness I have seldom witnessed in assemblies of white people than uniformly prevail here. Marsh's ministry among the Stockbridge nation began with optimism and enthusiasm on the part of the missionary. Although he would later discern some of the inherent problems and challenges in the Stockbridge mission, he labored in hope that the lost would be reached and that saints would be further established in their faith. Now we turn to another aspect of his work in canvassing the Western Reserve in Ohio. As a missionary of the American Board of Commissioners, Marsh received an assignment from the board to visit churches in the Western Reserve section of the state of Ohio. This area in northeastern Ohio, along Lake Erie, had originally been claimed by the state of Connecticut. Having completed his first year in Statesburg, Marsh was appointed to represent the board. His duties included to raise funds for the American Board, to revive county missionary associations, to inspect and report on the capabilities of preachers in the area who might be induced to labor for the American Board, and to get subscriptions to the Missionary Herald. He was also to attend Presbyterian meetings and discover whether the Presbyterians would continue to support the American Board after the organization of their own mission board at Pittsburgh. During this trip, Marsh visited small towns and settlements around Cleveland. He frequently preached, visited schools, attended conventions, met with individuals and congregations, and provided written reports to the American Board. He reported being favorably received in 56 towns where he preached about foreign missions activities, addressed numerous congregations, and helped organize 21 mission associations. Nichols summarizes the outcome of this trip as follows. The trip lasted nearly 5 months and proved to Marsh that many people had little interest, time, or money to spend on mission work of any kind. Although he collected over $400 in donations, he was discouraged by the size of many of the donations. He concluded that apathy and want of information and love to the cause operate more than anything else to make donations to foreign missions small. Marsh also encountered some opposition to missionary work, which provoked anger from him. This assignment demonstrates the missionary nature of Marsh's work. He was primarily called to serve the Stockbridge Indians, and that is where the lion's share of his energy and time were spent. But like many missionaries before and since, he had to devote a certain amount of time to fundraising and public relations with supporting churches and individuals. This part of his work was more administrative in nature, and it had the capacity to be both tiring and discouraging. Traveling from place to place over a 5-month period would tire out even the most energetic missionary. Encountering apathy and indifference for the work of missions would further sap the strength. In addition, the care of the mission station back in Statesburg suffered in his absence, and he returned home to problems that arose from his being away. So let's look at some of the problems facing the Stockbridge tribe. One of the chronic problems that faced the Stockbridge tribe was relocation by the U.S. government. This had accounted for their move from Stockbridge, Massachusetts to New Stockbridge, New York. From there, various proposals were made to move them to Indiana, Kansas, and the Wisconsin Territory. Well, having purchased and developed land along the Fox River, the suggestion of yet another move to the east side of Lake Winnebago was initially unappealing. They had cleared land and built structures in Statesburg, which they would have to leave behind for the new territory that needed to be cleared and prepared for agriculture, not to mention the construction of buildings. This would impact not only the farms of the Indians, but rather the mission as well. As I said last night, the U.S. government gained a notorious reputation for dishonesty relative to various treaties and agreements that they signed with these Indian tribes. Some treaties were never followed, others never provided the promised financial compensation, and always it seemed that the white settlers got the prime land while the Indians were moved to less desirable property and more remote locations. Although the Stockbridge Nation sent delegation after delegation to Washington, D.C. to meet with the president, with senators, and with congressmen, their claims were not fully honored by the government. And gradually, the Indians learned that they could not trust the honesty of the authorities in Washington. Not unrelated to this difficulty was the specter of alcohol, which we have also discussed. These unscrupulous traders supplied alcohol to the Indians contrary to state laws. Their motives were purely financial, and many Indians found it hard to resist the temptation. Sometimes even veteran church leaders would fall into bouts of drunkenness, and it really did havoc to the Christian community. Knowing that missionaries would promote temperance and prevent the sale of Indian lands, it led many of the white pagans to discourage Christian missions among the Indians. They warned that the influence of these ministers would make the Indians' lives more difficult. Some even lied to the Indians about the motives and practices of the missionaries in order to discourage participation in the churches. Despite these various problems, the Stockbridge people determined to leave Statesburg and to settle on the eastern side of Lake Winnebago in central Wisconsin. The towns that were established were Stockbridge, Wisconsin, and Brothertown, Wisconsin. Cutting Marsh was supportive of the move, and he took part in establishing a new location for the mission buildings, including both a school and a church building. The relocation was not without its own drama, as various parties jockeyed for the most desirable property in the new locale. Marsh represented the mission, and he spoke on behalf of the American Board. He insisted that the mission buildings be placed on lots near the center of the new town of Stockbridge. Others desired that land, and so a significant dispute arose between these contending parties. And in the end, Marsh got the location that the American Board wanted, but it was not without significant stress and cost. Next, we turn to another aspect of his work, the mission to the Iowa Indians. In 1833, Marsh and the Stockbridge Indians were visited by Black Hawk, a Sac chief. This was a year after a conflict which bore his name, the Black Hawk War. During his visit, Chief Black Hawk invited the leaders of the Stockbridge Nation to visit the Sacs and Foxes in Iowa. Nichols says that in 1833, the tribal council decided to send a delegation to visit the Sac, Fox, and Delaware tribes of Indians living in Iowa. The Stockbridges claimed to be distant relatives of these Indians, and they wanted to renew their old friendships. Erwin Bradfield argues in Early Presbyterians in Wisconsin that the Indian delegation had spiritual purposes as well. John Metoxen was particularly mentioned as desiring to see the gospel preached to these tribes, and his conduct during the trip supports this interpretation. Metoxen specifically addressed Chief Black Hawk about the possibility of missionaries coming to his people, seeking to persuade the Sacs and the Foxes to welcome a mission among them. On October 14, 1833, the headmen of the Stockbridge tribe sent a letter to the American Board of Commissioners, and it reads in part as follows: "Fathers, we ask if there is not some way that we can make our visit subserve, in some degree at least, the great object of your society. Cannot we tell them of the great benefits we have received from being taught the gospel? Can we not tell them that your society is ready to send teachers if they are willing to receive them? Can you not appoint a missionary to accompany us?" Now, this idea is not out of line with the initial plan for the Statesburg mission. In that original letter to Jesse Minor that I quoted in a previous lecture, the following provision was made that another object will be to learn the character of the neighboring tribes of Winnebagos and Menominees, to devise ways and means of getting access to them and of bringing a good influence to bear upon them. It was missionary in purpose from the very outset. Nichols summarizes the purpose of their expedition as follows. Marsh's second tour was to the west rather than the east. He traveled to the Iowa Territory and visited the major villages of the Sac and Fox Indians living there. His objective was to persuade the Indians to accept missions and schools, which would mean a modification of their entire way of life. With the agreement of the Indian leaders and the approval of the American Board of Commissioners, Marsh set out with John Metoxen, John Quinney, and 3 other Stockbridge Indian leaders. In his report to the American Board, Marsh describes something of the spiritual nature of their expedition. Every morning before setting out, we engage in reading the scriptures, each one reading in turn, singing and prayer, and in this manner close the day also. Morning devotions, evening devotions, bracketing their day. He also describes their experience on the Sabbath. In this solitary place, we pitched our tent and passed the holy Sabbath unmolested and in quiet, with none but our little company. At the hour of worship, we retired to the shade of some scrubby oaks, and although far from the sanctuary, still we felt it as good to draw near to God there as though we had been in the Christian assembly. A prayer meeting closed the day, which had been neither long nor tedious, but pleasant and profitable. This small gathering also enjoyed singing hymns throughout the Lord's Day, which was remarkable to those who observed their practice. When they arrived at their target territory, Marsh immediately sought out various officials. Explaining their purpose, Marsh met with polite responses that were non-committal at best. In reality, the commercial and governmental interests were against the idea of missionaries coming among these tribes. They actively discouraged the Sacs and the Foxes from agreeing to the proposal. The same refusal was encountered by the Stockbridge representatives. Mr. Metoxen had an interview with Black Hawk, who was returning from Rock Island to his village, which Mr. Metoxen had just been to visit. Black Hawk asked Metoxen, "Now what do you think is best about receiving missionaries?" Metoxen replied, "By all means receive them, for they will do you good." Black Hawk responded, "But the trader, Mr. Davenport, told me to have nothing to do with them, for they would only make you worse." Our attempt to establish a mission amongst the Sac and Foxes entirely failed of success. What a sad outcome. Well, having been rebuffed by their hosts, the Stockbridge delegation left for home without notifying Cutting Marsh. Marsh spent further time visiting other villages and speaking to leaders of other tribes. The responses ranged from indifference to veiled hostility. Marsh was greatly discouraged, especially when he discovered that the local officials had worked against him. And so he also determined to return home to Statesburg. Marsh did make the most of this opportunity for proclaiming the gospel. Nichols describes his efforts in one village. Since he was unable to establish a mission, Marsh concentrated on his program of personal contacts and preaching to the members of the tribe. He talked with anyone who would listen in an effort to convert them to Christianity. 2 days later, Marsh and the chief had another talk. He described it in the following manner. Soon after we had commenced eating, he began of his own accord to relate to the interpreter his belief. I took the opportunity to speak of Jesus Christ and the resurrection and explained it by a picture representing the rising of the dead at the last day. He listened attentively and examined the picture very particularly. And after I got through, he inquired if there was anybody now living who had seen this God and heard him speak these words. Though the outcome of the trip was disheartening to Marsh and to the Stockbridge leaders, their effort was commendable. By traveling to these tribes and openly proposing a mission among them, Marsh left those tribes and the local government officials without excuse. It also emphasized to the Stockbridge Christians their duty to evangelize their fellow tribes as a part of their own discipleship, and it provided opportunities to proclaim the gospel to those who had never heard it before. Now I want to turn the focus to the broader work in Wisconsin. In addition to his rigorous work with the Stockbridge Indians, Cutting Marsh was actively involved in starting Presbyterian churches throughout the Wisconsin territory. With the influx of settlers from the East Coast, there was both a need and a desire for Presbyterian churches to be planted in newly established communities. And Nichols reports this aspect of Marsh's labors as follows. Marsh's work among the Stockbridge was interrupted by short trips to other villages and towns for the purpose of organizing churches for the incoming white settlers. The archival records of the Union Congregational Church in Green Bay contain the following report. The Union Congregational Church of Green Bay, Wisconsin, one of the oldest churches in Wisconsin, was founded on September 21, 1835, as the First Presbyterian Church. The congregation of 12 members called the Reverend Cutting Marsh, a missionary from the American Missionary Society to the Stockbridge Indians. During the congregation's earliest days, Marsh came to Green Bay at 6-week intervals and preached at services conducted in the military hospital at Fort Howard. Nichols adds that it was founded with only 12 members and had no regular minister. He was to preach once every 6 weeks and to administer Holy Communion every second time. On October 28, 1836, the Reverend Moses Ordway was installed as the regular pastor, and this relieved Marsh of these trips to Green Bay. A month later, he was asked to do the same thing for a group at Fort Winnebago. In February 1836, he formally organized this church with 11 members. Fort Winnebago was down near Portage, Wisconsin. So he's all over the place. And he's not traveling in a nice new car on a highway. He's riding a horse, and it takes a lot of time and is quite uncomfortable, especially if there is weather to deal with. John Chapin also speaks of Marsh's broader ministry. He writes, "But we now turn to another side of Marsh's labors. Now we see him bearing an important part in laying the foundations of a new civilization in the Valley of the Fox. In September 1838, he took part in the dedication of the new Presbyterian church building at Green Bay. It was a joyful occasion. The little church, organized 2 years before, had struggled through great difficulties and was now realizing more than their expectations. Marsh preached the first sermon in it on September 9, 1838, from the words, "We walk by faith, not by sight." He describes the occasion as one of the most interesting he had ever enjoyed. And so Cutting Marsh is multi-talented and multi-focused. He could have easily said, I am called to work with the Stockbridge. I will stay in Statesburg and then later in Stockbridge and just do my job. But he has a broader vision, a greater desire, and with so many immigrants coming in from the eastern and southern states, he sees the need and he is there to meet the need. But not all was well with Cutting Marsh. He became the distressed missionary. Throughout his nearly 2 decades of service to the Stockbridge tribe, Cutting Marsh experienced what can only be described as intense spiritual warfare. Some have argued that these troubles came due to shortcomings in Marsh's theology, temperament, personality, and education. They suggest that the increasing difficulties that Marsh experienced toward the end of his tenure in Stockbridge were primarily his fault. Yet such a view underestimates the spiritual aspects of the work in which he was engaged. A number of components of this spiritual warfare predated Marsh's service and had little to do with this man. The destructive effects of alcohol upon the Indian tribes was seen across the Native American landscape. Marsh early introduced a temperance society which had remarkable success in discouraging drunkenness in the Stockbridge community. At one point, there were more members of the temperance society than there were members of his church. And yet, for all his efforts to discourage the abuse of alcohol, it remained a constant source of grief to the tribe. Another aspect of the ongoing spiritual warfare is well documented in missionary circles, and that is intra-staff conflicts. Missionaries fighting with missionaries. We would like to say, oh, that never, ever happens. It happens more often than not. Many missionaries leave their fields, not because the work among the group they serve is so difficult, but because they can't get along with other missionaries. Marsh was not the easiest person to deal with. He could be opinionated and outspoken. And yet frequently, the staff under his oversight sought to grasp at his authority as the mission superintendent. Marsh spent many valuable hours dealing with these in-house personal problems. Yet another set of grievances came due to the government's treaties and policies related to the Indian land question. Although Marsh sought to remain neutral in these disputes, he was frequently viewed as taking sides in tribal matters. He would get in the middle of situations that he sought to avoid, and both sides of the dispute became suspicious that he was an agent of the other side of the dispute. And he kept trying to get out of these discussions, and yet he had problems that he had to address. And then there were difficulties that face ministers of all ages and places. In one instance, a young Christian Indian widow wished to be married to a man who was not a believer and not a member of the church. Marsh attempted to handle this delicate pastoral issue and to explain why Scripture did not approve of a believer marrying an unbeliever. The widow was insistent, and her friends and her family put pressure on Marsh to perform the wedding. Marsh stood his ground, but he lost the affection of many in the tribe for his unwillingness to compromise his convictions. By the mid-1840s, Marsh was increasingly convinced that his ministry was ineffective and that the work ought to be shut down. The final straw was related to the dispute over citizenship. The U.S. government offered to make the Stockbridge Indians U.S. citizens, which would dissolve their tribal identity and their tribal government. About half the tribe wished to take the offer and to become U.S. citizens. The other half were unconvinced and wished to remain a distinct tribe with its own government. The carrot that the government offered was that if you become citizens, you can remain on your farms in Stockbridge, but if you want to retain your identity, you're going to have to go to a reservation in Shawano County. Yet another move to a remote location that was not exactly ideal. The division within the community effectively split the church in half. And Marsh found himself in a no-win situation, and his discouragement only deepened. In 1848, Cutting Marsh concluded his ministry among the Stockbridge Indians. He moved to De Pere, Wisconsin, where he pastored a church for a year. Following his time in De Pere, he and his family relocated to Waupaca, Wisconsin. From that location, he served as a minister at large, something of a regional missionary. He represented various missions agencies, and he traveled the state engaging in ministry. Marsh died in 1873. The Wisconsin Historical Society records his labors in these later years. After 1848, he carried on his missionary activities among the white settlers in Wisconsin and traveled extensively through the eastern part of the state, organizing churches at Fairfield, Oshkosh, Byron, and Berlin. He made Waupaca his headquarters, and from 1848 to 1856 served as pastor to a number of parishes. He retired from the ministry in 1856 and lived in Waupaca until his death. Chapin also describes his missionary labors in these latter years of ministry. He says, "And so, all over this region, from Green Bay to Baraboo, from Wausau to Columbus and Manitowoc, our missionary passed and repassed during the years 1849 to 56. There was not a village or a rustic community unvisited by him, and where he did not seek to establish Christian institutions. These explorations were made on horseback, over ill-defined pathways and unbridged roads. Sometimes he was lost, once in a cedar swamp, in which horse and man were obliged to spend the night. Another time, his horse was mired, and he walked several miles before getting help to pry the animal out. Often the missionary was in peril from the elements and from vicious men. But all over this region, he continued with unwearied devotion to read, pray and exhort in families, and to preach in private houses or in schoolhouses or upper halls. Often we find him prescribing at the sickbed when the physician was far away or when the expensive one could not well be borne. John Chapin movingly describes Cutting Marsh's overall ministry. In Marsh's diary, reports, and letters, we read of that devoted missionary's round of work, his visits to the sick and dying, his personal interviews with the impenitent and the careless, with the anxious and the troubled, with the poor and the needy and the ignorant. We see him preaching twice on every Sunday, superintending the Sunday school, conducting a weekly prayer meeting, laboring in revivals and rejoicing in new converts. We see him following up the delinquent in duty, encouraging the weak, distributing religious books and tracts, burying the dead, and comforting the afflicted. His hands and heart are continually full. Sometimes we find him overwhelmed with care and responsibility and a sense of his own unfitness and unworthiness, but never once does he think of abandoning his duty, of forsaking his post. Cutting Marsh was a remarkable example of a man seeking first his kingdom and his righteousness. For the Stockbridge Indians, he was most willing to spend and be spent on their behalf. His incessant labor, his endurance of hardship, his desire to preach the gospel to anyone who would listen are all exemplary. His commitments to Calvinistic theology and to the Presbyterian form of government are heartwarming, though not much appreciated by modern historians. This stern, grim, unbending New England Calvinist was God's blessing to the virgin territory of Wisconsin. And through Marsh, the Lord furthered the development of Presbyterianism in our state. Thank you.